There was a moment not too long ago when my son sat across from me in complete silence, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, and I knew something was different before he even opened his mouth. Mothers notice these things, especially mothers who have spent their entire lives watching the same pair of eyes carry pressure, loneliness, ambition, heartbreak, exhaustion, and hope all at once. Elon has always tried to look strong for the world. He learned very early that people admire strength, but rarely make space for softness. And when a man spends years being treated like a machine, eventually he forgets how to speak about the parts of himself that still ache quietly at night. But that evening felt different. He looked at me the way he used to when he was a little boy trying to explain something too big for his own heart to understand. Then he smiled in that small guarded way of his, and said, "Mum, I need to tell you something about her. And I cannot explain to you what happened inside me when he said those words. Because when you are a mother, especially the mother of a son who carries the weight of entire worlds on his shoulders, you secretly pray that someday someone will finally hold his heart gently enough for him to stop fighting all the time." Before I tell you what he said next, let me ask you something, woman to woman. Have you ever looked at someone you love and realized they are far lonelier than the world could ever imagine? Not physically alone, not socially alone, I mean emotionally alone. The kind of loneliness that hides behind success, behind busy schedules, behind confidence, behind laughter at dinner tables. I think many women over 50 understand this feeling better than anyone, because we have spent our lives noticing what others miss. We notice the pauses. We notice tired smiles. We notice when someone changes the subject because the truth hurts too much to touch. And I noticed for years that my son knew how to build companies, rockets, systems, futures, but he still struggled with the one thing every human being truly wants in the end. To come home to someone who understands their soul without needing it explained. If this conversation already feels close to your heart, gently press like and subscribe so we can keep sharing these quiet moments together. Tell me where you are watching from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I always wonder how many women sit awake late at night thinking about love differently now than they did when they were younger. Share this with someone who still believes deep love exists even after disappointment. And if you stay with me until the end, I think you may understand something very personal about my son that almost nobody sees. You know, people often assume that mothers of successful sons only care about achievement. They think we sit proudly counting headlines and accomplishments and public victories. But those things become strangely unimportant after a certain age. What matters to me now is whether my son eats properly, whether he sleeps enough, whether he has someone who listens to him when the cameras disappear, whether there is a woman somewhere who sees beyond the billionaire, beyond the inventor, beyond the public figure, and notices the exhausted human being underneath all of it. I think women understand this instinctively. A woman can look at a man everyone else admires and still see the little wounded boy hiding inside him. And perhaps that is why I have thought so deeply about who could truly love Elon the right way. I have asked myself impossible questions over the years. What kind of woman could survive loving a man whose mind never stops moving? What kind of woman would not become intimidated by his intensity? What kind of woman would understand that brilliance often comes with emotional storms? And more importantly, what kind of woman would protect his heart instead of competing with his ego? Because people think powerful men need admiration, but what they truly need is peace. They need softness. They need someone who creates emotional silence around them when the world becomes too loud. Do you agree with that? Or do you think modern relationships have forgotten how important peace truly is? When Elon finally began speaking that evening, I listened carefully, because mothers can hear things hidden between words. He told me about conversations with you. Long conversations, honest conversations, the kind that leave a man quieter afterward because something inside him has finally exhaled. He said you listened differently than most people do, not impatiently, not strategically, not waiting for your turn to speak. He said you listened as though his thoughts mattered, even when they were unfinished and messy. And I cannot describe to you how rare that is for a man like my son. Most people listen to powerful men with an agenda already in their minds. They want something, attention, access, status, validation. But genuine listening, genuine emotional presence, that is becoming rare in this world. And then he said something that stayed with me all night long. He looked down at the table and quietly said, "She doesn't make me feel like I have to perform all the time." I almost cried when I heard that. Because do you know how exhausting it is for a person to feel they must constantly impress the world, just to deserve love? Some men become addicted to achievement because they secretly fear that without it, nobody would stay, and I think many women over 50 understand exactly what I mean, because perhaps you once loved a man who only knew how to express worth through work. Maybe you spent years waiting for him to finally relax enough to simply be loved. As a mother, I have always tried to understand the emotional cost of ambition. People celebrate ambition because they only see the outcomes. They see the headlines, they see the money, they see the influence, but they rarely see the emotional sacrifices hidden underneath it all. They do not see birthdays missed mentally even while physically present. They do not see how difficult it becomes for a man to trust love when so many people approach him with hidden intentions. And they certainly do not see how desperately some powerful men crave ordinary affection. A quiet dinner, a gentle touch on the shoulder, someone asking, "Did you sleep okay?" without wanting anything in return. Tell me honestly, do you think love becomes softer or harder after 50? I ask myself this often. Because when we are young, we chase excitement, we chase chemistry, we chase fantasy. But later in life, I think women begin craving emotional safety more than emotional chaos. We stop wanting to prove ourselves. We stop wanting games. We stop romanticizing instability. We begin understanding that mature love is not loud all the time. Sometimes mature love is simply consistency, presence, kindness repeated quietly over many years. There is another thing people misunderstand about Elon. They assume he only values intelligence because he himself is extraordinarily intelligent. But intelligence alone has never impressed him deeply. He admires emotional depth far more than people realize. He notices sincerity. He notices resilience. He notices when someone has survived pain without becoming cruel. And as his mother, I notice what kind of women leave him emotionally calmer afterward, instead of emotionally drained. That matters tremendously to me now, because at this stage of life I no longer care who appears glamorous beside my son in photographs. I care who protects his spirit when nobody else is watching. I remember when he was young, he would become completely absorbed in books for hours, almost disappearing into his own imagination. Even then, I worried about whether anyone would someday truly understand him emotionally. Highly intelligent people often become emotionally isolated because their minds move differently, and if they are not careful, they can spend entire lifetimes being admired without ever being deeply known. That is one of the saddest forms of loneliness imaginable, to be seen everywhere publicly and still remain unseen privately. When he told me more about you, I listened carefully to every small detail, because mothers analyze everything when it comes to their sons. He told me you ask thoughtful questions. He told me you remember small things he mentions casually. He told me you are gentle without being weak. That mattered to me. So many people confuse softness with fragility, but they are not the same thing at all. Some of the strongest women I have ever met were incredibly gentle. In fact, true femininity often carries enormous emotional strength, because it knows how to nurture without controlling. Can I ask you something deeply personal? Have you ever loved someone so much that you began praying more carefully for them than for yourself? That is motherhood. People speak about motherhood as sacrifice, but sometimes it feels more like permanent emotional vulnerability. A mother never fully stops worrying, even when her children become powerful adults, even when the world sees them as untouchable. Somewhere inside, she still remembers the child who once needed comfort after a difficult day. There were times when I worried that Elon's life had become too fast for real intimacy. The faster life moves, the harder it becomes to sit still emotionally with another person, and love requires stillness sometimes. It requires attention, patience, space. You cannot rush genuine emotional connection. And I think many modern relationships fail, because people no longer know how to slow down enough to truly know each other. Everyone is distracted. Everyone is performing. Everyone is protecting themselves. But real love requires emotional risk. It requires allowing another person to witness your imperfections without immediately running away. That evening, my son spoke more openly than he usually does. I noticed something softening in him, while he talked about you. Not weakness, not distraction, relief. And mothers recognize relief immediately, because we spend years hoping our children eventually find people who feel emotionally safe to them. He said something else quietly, that has stayed in my heart ever since. He said, "I think she sees me more clearly than most people do." Do you understand how powerful that sentence is? To be clearly seen by another human being, without feeling judged. That is one of the rarest experiences in life. I sometimes wonder whether women realize how deeply men remember emotional safety. A man may forget compliments, he may forget appearances, But he never forgets the woman who made him feel emotionally understood during a difficult season of his life. Never. Especially not men who spend their lives under pressure. Those men remember softness forever, because softness becomes oxygen to them. As I sat there listening to my son speak about you, I found myself quietly imagining impossible little things mothers imagine. What would mornings feel like in a peaceful home for him? Would he finally laugh more? Would he finally rest emotionally? Would someone remind him that he does not always need to save the future before breakfast? And perhaps you are smiling right now because you understand exactly what I mean. Sometimes women become emotional shelters for the people they love. Not because they lose themselves, but because nurturing is one of the deepest forms of love. But I must confess something honestly. Loving a man like Elon would not be simple. I would never lie to you about that. Great ambition often comes with emotional complexity. Some days he becomes distant because his mind disappears into problems larger than most people can imagine. Some days he carries stress silently instead of expressing it immediately, and sometimes he forgets that the people who love him need reassurance too. Yet underneath all of that intensity is a deeply sensitive heart that has been bruised more times than the public understands. I think mature women recognize this better than younger women sometimes do. After 50, many women stop expecting perfection from love. We begin valuing honesty over fantasy. We understand that every human being arrives carrying scars, habits, fears, and unfinished emotional stories. Real love is not finding a flawless person. It is finding someone whose flaws you can hold with compassion, instead of resentment. And as the evening grew quieter, my son finally told me the one thing that made my heart ache in the most beautiful way. He looked at me and said, "Mom, she makes me think differently about the future." I went completely silent after that because mothers know when a sentence carries truth. A woman who changes how a man sees the future is never ordinary to him. Never. What he told me after that, what he admitted quietly while staring out the window, is something I have not stopped thinking about since that night. And the reason it affected me so deeply is because it revealed a side of my son the world almost never gets to see. I did not answer him immediately after he said those words. I simply watched him for a moment, because something inside his face had changed in a way only a mother would notice. The world sees confidence when they look at my son. They see certainty. They see a man who makes impossible decisions quickly and carries enormous responsibility without hesitation. But I have known him long enough to recognize when his heart is speaking louder than his mind. And that night, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, his heart was leading the conversation. He leaned back in his chair and became unusually quiet. Elon has always done that, when emotions begin getting too close to the surface. He pauses. He looks away. He pretends to think about something else for a moment, because vulnerability does not come naturally to men who have spent years surviving pressure. Then he smiled softly and said, "She makes me feel human again." I cannot explain to you what those words did to me as his mother, because no woman gives birth hoping her son will become powerful, but emotionally exhausted. We hope they become kind. We hope they become loved. We hope someone someday touches their life gently enough that they no longer feel they must carry everything alone. Tell me honestly, have you ever watched someone slowly disappear into work because they were afraid to sit alone with their own feelings? I think many women understand this deeply, because women often notice emotional exhaustion long before men admit it themselves. A man may continue functioning perfectly while quietly starving emotionally inside, and when that happens for too many years, he begins forgetting what tenderness even feels like. That is why I listened so carefully when Elon spoke about you. He did not describe glamour. He did not talk about beauty first. He talked about peace. Do you realize how meaningful that is? A younger man might chase excitement without understanding the cost of chaos. But eventually life teaches people what truly matters. Peace matters. Emotional safety matters. The ability to sit beside someone in silence without tension matters. He told me about late-night conversations where hours passed without either of you noticing the time. He said you asked him questions nobody usually asks. Not questions about business or success or public opinions. Real questions, personal questions, questions about fear, about loneliness, about childhood memories, about whether he ever gets tired of carrying expectations all the time. And I sat there thinking, perhaps this woman understands something many people never do. Even the strongest men become exhausted from constantly being strong. I remember asking him quietly, "Do you trust her?" Because mothers ask the questions that truly matter. And he answered so quickly it almost surprised me. He said yes without hesitation. Then he added something even more important. He said, I don't feel manipulated around her. That sentence stayed with me all night, because trust has become incredibly difficult for people living under constant attention. Imagine never fully knowing whether affection is genuine. Imagine questioning people's intentions over and over, until your heart becomes cautious by instinct. And perhaps that is why mature love feels different. Older women understand that real connection cannot survive manipulation. Games become exhausting after a certain age. Emotional confusion becomes unattractive. At some point we stop wanting intensity that leaves us anxious, and begin wanting steadiness that allows us to breathe peacefully. Do you know what else touched me deeply? He told me you make him laugh during moments when he normally feels overwhelmed. That matters more than people realize. Laughter inside love is not a small thing. It is emotional medicine, especially for someone whose mind rarely rests. A woman who can make a tired man laugh without forcing it is bringing light into places he may not even realize had become dark. As his mother, I have spent years wondering whether someone would truly love the private version of my son, instead of the public image surrounding him. Would anyone still stay during difficult moods, during emotional distance, during stressful seasons when life becomes heavy and complicated? Because genuine love reveals itself most clearly during inconvenient moments, not glamorous ones. And the truth is, what he confessed next made me emotional, in ways I did not expect. He admitted that lately, he had started imagining slowing down sometimes, not completely. I do not think my son will ever fully stop moving. But for the first time in years, he sounded like a man imagining companionship instead of simply responsibility. And when he spoke about you, there was warmth in his voice that no achievement has ever given him. I looked at him and suddenly remembered the little boy who once needed reassurance after difficult days at school. The same sensitive heart was still there underneath all the ambition, all the pressure, all the public expectations. Mothers never forget that hidden version of their sons. Then he said something so quietly I almost missed it. He said, Mum, I think she could actually understand this life. And at that moment, I realized this was no ordinary conversation anymore. When my son said those words, I felt something shift very deeply inside me, because I understood what he truly meant, even though he did not explain it completely. Most people think understanding a man like Elon means understanding technology, ambition, business, or intelligence. But that is the easy part. The difficult part is understanding the emotional cost of being him. Understanding the pressure, understanding the isolation, understanding what happens to a person after years of carrying expectations so heavy that even ordinary moments begin feeling complicated. And I remember looking at him carefully while he stared out the window, almost lost inside his own thoughts, and I suddenly realized how tired he really was. Not physically tired, soul tired. There is a difference. A person can sleep 8 hours and still feel emotionally exhausted if they have spent too many years living without real emotional peace. I think many women over 50 understand this better than anyone, because by this age we have learned that emotional exhaustion ages the heart faster than time itself. I asked him quietly, what makes you feel so different around her? And for a moment he did not answer. He simply smiled in that thoughtful way he has when he is trying to put emotions into words without sounding too vulnerable. Then he finally said, she doesn't need me to become someone else before loving me. I cannot fully explain to you how deeply that affected me. Because so many people enter relationships carrying hidden conditions. They love pieces of each other instead of the whole human being. They admire strengths while resenting weaknesses. They want companionship without emotional responsibility. But real love, mature love, the kind of love that survives life itself, is built differently. It says, I see your chaos, your fears, your exhaustion, your imperfections, and I am still here. And perhaps that is why I suddenly became emotional, listening to him speak about you. Not because he sounded obsessed, not because he sounded infatuated, but because he sounded safe. There is something incredibly beautiful about hearing a man finally sound emotionally safe. Tell me something honestly. Have you ever met someone who made your nervous system feel calm instead of confused? Someone whose presence softened the noise in your mind instead of increasing it? I think too many people mistake emotional intensity for love, when often real love feels much quieter. It feels steady, gentle, familiar, like finally putting down a heavy bag you forgot you were carrying. Elon told me that when he speaks to you, he does not feel judged for the parts of himself that are difficult to explain. And I think this matters tremendously because highly driven people often feel misunderstood, even inside relationships. Their minds move quickly. Their emotions sometimes arrive late. Their stress can become overwhelming. And if the wrong person enters their life, love can begin feeling like another battlefield instead of a refuge. I remember asking him, "Does she understand how hard your life can become?" And he answered with complete honesty. He said, "I think she understands me more emotionally than people who have known me for years." That sentence stayed in my heart because emotional understanding is not measured by time. Some people spend decades together without truly seeing one another, and then occasionally two people meet and recognize each other's emotional language almost immediately. As his mother, I have always worried about whether someone would appreciate his sensitivity instead of punishing him for it. People rarely talk about sensitive men because the world teaches men to hide softness very early. But my son has always felt things deeply, even when he tried not to show it. Sensitive men often become ambitious because achievement feels safer than vulnerability. Building companies becomes easier than explaining emotional wounds. Solving global problems becomes easier than admitting loneliness. And perhaps this is why your presence affected him differently. He told me you listen carefully during moments when he becomes emotionally quiet instead of rushing to fill the silence. That may sound small to some people, but it is not small at all. Silence inside love can feel either comforting or terrifying depending on the emotional maturity between two people. A woman who can sit peacefully beside a complicated man without demanding constant performance creates a kind of safety that is extremely rare. I found myself thinking about relationships differently after that conversation. You know, when we are younger, many of us believe love is supposed to feel dramatic all the time. We think passion must always be loud. We mistake unpredictability for chemistry. But life eventually teaches us that sustainable love often feels calm instead of chaotic. Mature love allows people to rest emotionally without fear of abandonment every time life becomes stressful. And I must tell you something very honest, woman to woman. There were years when I worried my son would never fully slow down enough to let himself be loved properly, not because he did not want love, but because deeply ambitious people sometimes become addicted to movement. They keep running because slowing down means finally feeling everything they avoided emotionally for years. But when he spoke about you, I heard something different in his voice. I heard stillness, hope, tenderness. Then he confessed something that almost brought tears to my eyes. He said, "I don't feel lonely when I talk to her." Do you understand how heartbreaking and beautiful that sentence is at the same time? Imagine being surrounded by millions of people, constant attention, endless conversations, and still feeling emotionally alone most of the time. Loneliness is not about physical presence. It is about emotional connection. A person can sleep beside someone every night and still feel invisible inside the relationship. I think many women watching understand this pain personally. Perhaps you once spent years trying to emotionally reach someone who remained distant, no matter how much love you gave them. Or perhaps you yourself felt unseen inside a relationship where everything looked perfect from the outside. That is why emotional intimacy matters so much more than appearances. Eventually beauty changes, success changes, circumstances change, but emotional safety becomes priceless with age. As I listened to my son speak, I realized something important. The woman he truly needs is not necessarily the woman who impresses the world most loudly. He needs the woman who understands how to bring warmth back into his private life, the woman who reminds him he is human before he is extraordinary. The woman who can hold his hand during difficult seasons without making him feel weak for needing comfort. And I began imagining small ordinary things that suddenly felt deeply meaningful to me. Someone asking him whether he ate dinner after a stressful day. Someone noticing when exhaustion reaches his eyes before he says a word. Someone pulling him back emotionally when his mind drifts too far into pressure and responsibility. Love often reveals itself through these quiet details more than grand gestures. Then I asked him something only a mother would ask. I said, "Can you imagine growing old peacefully with her?" And he became very quiet after that. Long enough that I knew the question touched somewhere deep inside him. Finally he smiled softly and said, "For the first time in a long time, maybe I can." That answer stayed with me, because men rarely speak that honestly, unless something inside them has genuinely changed. And in that moment, I realized this was no temporary fascination. This was something softer, deeper, more frightening in a way, because real love always carries risk. Real love requires surrendering parts of yourself you spent years protecting. I want to ask you something deeply personal before I finish. Do you think people become more afraid of love as they grow older, or more ready for it? I think about this often, because by this age most of us carry scars, disappointments, betrayals, memories of people who promised forever and disappeared anyway. Yet, despite all of that, the human heart still hopes. Isn't that extraordinary? No matter how much life hurts us, some small part inside still longs to be understood completely by another soul. As a mother, all I have ever truly wanted is for my son to find someone beside whom he no longer feels he must constantly fight the world alone. Someone who sees beyond the headlines and notices the man underneath all the noise. Someone who understands that even the strongest people need tenderness too. And after hearing everything he told me about you that night, I finally understood why his voice sounded softer than it had in years. Because sometimes love does not enter a person's life like fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly and teaches a tired heart how to rest again.